Okay, so welcome everyone to the Humane Hangouts podcast. Today I'm joined by Tobias Leenaert, who is a vegan activist, speaker, educator, and author. He's author of the book How to Create a Vegan World, which is where I first learned about his ideas. But he's also co-founded many organizations, including the Centre for Effective Vegan Advocacy with Melanie Joy, ProVeg International, and Ethical Vegetarian Alternative. So thanks for joining me today, Tobias.
Thanks for having me.
So I know you told me earlier that when it comes to podcasts, you don't really like how long the introductions can be and you prefer them just to get into the nitty and gritty. So I guess that's what we'll do here. I think when it comes to the animal movement, there's obviously lots of signs of progress. You were talking to me earlier and you mentioned how we have so many plant-based alternatives now. We've also seen a lot of welfare reform. There's even some legislation change. But of course, with any movement like this, there's going to be a lot of space for improvement. And it seems from reading your work and seeing the talks you give, you seem to focus a lot on encouraging other activists to think about effectiveness rather than directly communicating to like non-vegans themselves. What is it that led you to kind of getting meta with this and thinking about how activists can be more effective?
Yeah, I think what I noticed with myself was that there sometimes was a discrepancy or a non-alignment between what had an impact, what had actual results, and what I like to do. So what I like to do was to really go all out and I wouldn't say shame people, but be quite clear in my judgment about of meat eating, etc. And I felt good when I was doing that, and it felt good when I was morally judging other people, etc. And so because you feel good doing that, it is very tempting to keep doing that and to also think that that is a good thing to do. But unfortunately, I think there is this non-alignment between how you feel about something, certain actions or interventions or communication styles, and how impactful they are. And sometimes or often being calmer, maybe not talking about the animals but about other issues to help the animals, maybe about environment or climate change, maybe not being so black and white, all these aspects might make your communication style more effective, but maybe a bit less fun, a bit less satisfying, because you're not judging the other one, you're not feeling morally superior or whatever. That's exactly what makes it more effective, but less fun. So we should be wary of doing something that gives us a good feeling, but that isn't necessarily effective for animals.
Right. So would you say that earlier on in your advocacy then you were a lot more confrontational and aggressive, and now, upon reflection, you've become a lot calmer and more empathetic towards non-vegans?
Yes, I started as a typical animal rights or young, fiery animal rights activist. And it was through founding an organization that I found out that, if you want to have impact, you have to work with other parties, other stakeholders, could be researchers or media people or politicians or businesses, companies. And they're always going to spread your message in a way that is not ideal for you. They're always going to add water to the wine, and also talking to them, you have to, in order to convince them, you have to speak in a pragmatic way, not judgmental way, etc. So it is by being part of an organization and by working together with all these stakeholders that I kind of discovered, we cannot just be or do this black and white thinking. And I think this is the difference between basically, let's say, activists who are part of an organization that really wants together with other people, and individual activists, grassroots activists who are not part of an institutional organization, but who are mainly maybe they have the little group, but they're maybe talking to people in the streets. And when you talk to people in the streets, you can be maybe more free to do what you want. When you talk to a politician, you have to be more careful. So I think that's a big divide. Let's say, not a divide in terms of one against the other or something, but a big difference, like on the one hand, individual activists and grassroots, on the one hand, the more professional organizations that work together with a lot of stakeholders. There's this two kind of like, you see that reflected often in different communication styles and different interventions.
Interesting. So you find that people who work within institutions are probably considering more how they're coming across to others, or perhaps they're being directed by the institution to come across in a certain way, whereas individuals seem more free to just share their opinions and say things how it is.
Yeah, because the organizations, the animal or vegan organizations, have a bigger stake here. They want to work together. They want these other institutions, these other whatever academics or media people or businesses. They want them to spread their message further. So you're going to have to be more compromising and more pragmatic. Whereas when you're just talking to people in the street, you can just have your go vegan message for the animals, and that will be fine. And whether the people listen to that or not, I mean, yeah, preferably they listen to it. But if you do that, if you have this kind of like inflexible go vegan for the animals approach, if you use that towards politicians, etc., it's not going to do very much very often, So there you have to adapt and be more flexible and more pragmatic.
I suppose one thing worth mentioning here when we're having a conversation about strategy and effectiveness, whether it's whether you're confrontational or not confrontational, or whether it's about institutional versus individual change, I guess we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty here, because the evidence we haven't got that much data on how the things we're doing are affecting the suffering of animals, really. There's a lot of uncertainty, and of course we are very flawed, biased apes who are prone to making mistakes. So I suppose there's going to be people listening to this podcast who are probably going to disagree with things you say and probably things that I say. And perhaps we're getting some things wrong. I mean, you mentioned before that you used to be more confrontational, so you've certainly changed your approach. I've changed my mind on a number of things. So I suppose it's worth saying that we're not saying that we have all the answers. I suppose rather than thinking, okay, I've gone vegan, I've thought about this, now I know everything and I have to preach that. It's more like we should just encourage to have these kind of conversations, because effectiveness is important, because it's literally going to change the number of animals who are suffering terribly on factory farms and slaughterhouses. So I think it's important to create a culture where we can have these kind of conversations without feeling like we're attacking each other and shaming each other for not being good enough.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And so that's why we have to encourage organizations who are researching into what is most effective, and donations to those organizations like Phonolytics and things like that. But I think there is especially the danger of an ideology like veganism is an ideology providing a lot of answers, a lot of certainty, a lot of rules. There is a danger there that we might be too prone and too quick to think that all the answers have been given and everything has been solved, all the questions have been answered, because this is this system in which we're feeling safe and we're following the rules and we don't have to question it anymore. And that is tempting, and that is also not beneficial to help the animals. We should, I think it comes down to remaining open-minded, not being, I always say, like a non-vegan, they were maybe locked in some kind of carnistic box. Their thinking was limited, and then as the non-vegan, all of a sudden you jump out of the box and you become vegan, but you might end up in another box, which is the vegan box. And the vegan box, again, with its rules and its concepts and its definitions, can again limit your thinking and can again prevent you from seeing other ways to make more progress. I agree. We have to look at research, and we have to remain open-minded as to what works and what doesn't work, because otherwise we'll be slower to make progress than we otherwise could be.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned in one of your talks, the vegan box is much better than the carnist box.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, but it's still a box.
Still a box, yeah. And it's a very, very complicated world out there, and the ways in which our actions will change the world, there's a lot of unknowns there, a lot of unknown unknowns. One example is wild animal suffering. It seems like when you start considering the perspective of wild animals, then things become even more complicated. If we abolish factory farming, how does that impact wild animals? Because there's going to be effects there. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about wild animal suffering later on. But with that out of the way, the fact that we are, very flawed apes, so to take our opinions lightly, and obviously we might be changing them in the future, I still think it's good to have this conversation. So let's talk about confrontation versus non-confrontation. So one argument I've heard in favor of taking a more confrontational approach is that we've seen those approaches work in the past. For example, with the anti-slavery movement, with women's suffrage, the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It seems like there's lots of famous acts of defiance that were kind of confrontational and angered people to the point where activists would be assaulted. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think comparing with other movements can be useful, but we should also be careful not to draw parallels where there are none or where the parallels are not so strong. I think that a lot depends on public support for a cause, and I think that public support for the liberation of animals, for not eating, not consuming animals, is still a lot lower than for instance, the support for abolition was pretty early on when the movement started, from pretty early on. So we have to be careful there. On the other hand, I think everything in terms of like what is effective and what is not is mainly a matter of time. So you have to look at where you are in the time, or at what moment you are on the scale of the movement. I think in a sense you could say we're still pretty early, but I think that even if I think certain interventions right now, like screaming in people's faces or being very confrontational, tying yourself up in a restaurant or whatever, even if I think that some of those things might not be very effective right now and it's best to avoid them, I think at the same time that these things will be effective at another moment. Including even maybe more dramatic, more aggressive things. There will be a time, I think, when there will be enough public support for people entering properties, maybe destroying things. Like if there would be some company that holds enslaved people today, we would all be right in just entering and doing whatever to that company almost. So that time will come, I think, also for the animals. But we should not do it, I think, before it's time. So when is the time there? That is, of course, hard to tell. But again, we're often inclined to feel that the time is there before it is really there. We feel this fire and we feel like now we should act, and we've just seen this horrible YouTube video and our emotions flare up and we think like, let's go out there and let's do this or do that. But then we forget that most of the people are not on our side yet. So really looking at the public support. I think public support is about having a critical mass, and if you would know that if you take to the streets, enough people would follow and would follow you on the streets and would follow you with their whatever, their slogans, etc. Yes, then the time is right. But at this time, if you look at animal rights marches, the biggest ones, I think the biggest ones are just maybe 10,000 people. So that's not that. And that's just coming to the street for animals. I don't think that's very impressive yet. I think we'll get there. We'll get further than this. But right now, I don't think there's enough public support for really aggressive things. But I might be wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very good point. I guess to say that there isn't to favor a non-confrontational approach isn't to say that there isn't any room for any confrontation. I guess like everything is going to be nuanced and depending on like the specific context. Like for instance, if activists were targeting institutions, I feel like perhaps you can get away with more confrontation compared to targeting like individual members of the public who want to get on our side.
Absolutely, and I think it also depends on like what are we talking about exactly, which species of animal are we liberating or helping, in what circumstances are these animals being held or bred. Like suppose there's like an incredibly cruel medical experiment that doesn't seem to serve much purpose, and then you have some animal liberators who get into that building and they liberate these animals. It's not impossible that they are seen as heroes even by the big public in certain circumstances. In other circumstances, it might not be. So it depends on your communication style. What are you going to tell in terms of story around it? How are you dressed? How are you communicating? So all these things will determine how the public sees you, perceives you. But I think we should be really careful when we do things that are beyond a certain threshold.
I suppose one thing we probably should do in this part of the conversation is to kind of define what we mean by confrontational and non-confrontational. Because I guess it's not always necessarily that clear. Would you say that for a protest to be confrontational, would you call it, say, Would we describe it as perhaps causing anger or disturbing people's daily lives in some way?
Yeah, I would say there's a spectrum, and the spectrum maybe ranges, you could say, from generating certain feelings, like you say, of shame and guilt, etc. You might call that already a bit confrontational, as opposed to like a softer approach that doesn't generate those feelings, all the way up to maybe destroying property and putting a McDonald's, setting fire to McDonald's or something. That's the other end of the spectrum. One example I always give is Sea Shepherd, which is it's a pretty confrontational approach. What these people do on their ship against Japanese whaleboats, etc. And you could see this the appreciation that many people have for Sea Shepherd, including celebrities giving them millions of dollars, etc. You could see this as an aspect of the fact that, there's much more public support and much more appreciation and sympathy for whales than for pigs. If it would be Pig Shepherd and there was like a big tank rolling over a factory farm or something, there would be a lot less public support for that. So that's an illustration of the different causes having different degrees of public support.
And to go back to the comparison between our movement and other social movements throughout history who had these moments of confrontation, I guess another difference is that, and perhaps this is what separates us out from most causes that we think about throughout history, is that the oppressed aren't speaking for themselves. Yeah. We are allies in this, and perhaps that has some psychological effects where if we're talking to the public about this, maybe they're more likely to get defensive and feel like we're being pushy towards them, compared to if a being speaks up for their own rights, which seems to, I don't know, it seems to, I'd imagine it's probably more effective if a being can do that.
I think so, and I think that is one of the big differences between ours and other movements. The fact that the victims cannot speak for themselves; they're not part of the fight. And another very obvious difference is, of course, that it's about animals versus non-human animals, and people still care more about humans, and they can tolerate more civil action, etc. when it's about the liberation of humans than it's about the liberation of animals. But again, I think that, and I trust that will change over time.
Okay, here's another point people make in favor of being more confrontational. It's that it seems to get a lot more attention. And, it's so hard to get the media to take notice of this issue. But if someone does something very confrontational, it seems to get out there. The message, at least, seems to get out there, or the actions, at least, get out there. And I suppose someone could argue that by being more confrontational, it kind of stresses the importance of it, that this is something worth getting angry over. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, the attention that something generates is, of course, very important. And in this world, you have to do something special to generate media attention, etc. But then I think it would be good if we did more studies in order to really assess how people would react to that news coverage. It's hard to say. Like sometimes the activists publish a video on Facebook or YouTube, and you can look at the reactions or something, but those might be like there might be some self-filtering effect of like the people in support coming there, or the opposite of that. So it's really hard. So we should have like representative studies where we show something to people in order to be able to assess what they think about that. And even that is not simple, because people might give an initial reaction of being against or in favor, and a week later or maybe a few hours later they think differently about it. So it's I think really, really hard, and there's definitely more research that needs to be done in terms of this. But as to what you said about like showing that it's a thing that we can get angry about, I'm a bit in doubt, because there's a lot of things that we do get angry about, and still a lot of people don't take it seriously. Greta Thunberg is so angry about climate change, and so many people are laughing at her anger. Again, hard to measure. Hard to measure the effect of Greta Thunberg. Is she generating mostly support, or is she generating a lot of people being turned off by it? It's hard to say. It's also inevitable that some people are going to be against and turned off. So to what extent we have to take that into account is also unclear, I think. Yeah, in general, I'm prone to communicate in a non-confrontational way, but I'm also aware that might betray a personal bias, like that I'm not a non-confrontational person that is conflict avoidant. So that's also a possibility. So, yeah, again, we come back to the same point. Research is necessary to surpass our own anecdotal and individual feelings and evidence.
Yeah, so we can acknowledge that the more confrontational events do get more attention, and it is actually an important variable, how much attention and how much coverage you get with an action. It's just that it's not the only variable, and it's probably not the most important variable, I suppose. Would you agree with me that perhaps the most important variable for most actions that we see is kind of gaining that public support, getting people on board and getting the community to grow larger?
Yeah, I think that's a good metric. The only thing is it's really hard. I mean, like PETA, for instance, they have long said, or they're still saying, like there's no such thing as bad press, and they do anything to get attention. But and some people would say, like, yeah, that's all good, because when people talk about it, when there's a debate, this issue is in the media and it's alive, and we make progress, etc. But there might be a large number of people just being turned off from whatever they're seeing. The metric is not how many eyeballs do you get for a certain video or a certain intervention or action, but how many people would be positively influenced and who would be prone to appreciate the issue more than before they saw the intervention or before they were confronted with it. And again, that is hard to measure.
Yeah, it's surprising to me that the whole, there isn't any press that's bad press statement is still going around, because from what I understand, the backfire effect is actually a well-studied phenomenon. Like a lot of people do get turned off and reduce the support they have for a cause based on the approach taken.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at issues that are much more accepted today in the world than the issue of animal liberation, if you look at racism, and if you look at the aversion that people feel for wokeness, you can see that still there are ways in which many people get turned off from certain causes, and of course, that happens no matter how carefully we are in formulating these causes. So sure. The question again is, to what extent should we take into account the haters? I think we have to look at especially at how many haters or how many people are against it. If it's a small fraction, it's no problem. They will always be there. But if a big part of community or the public would be critical or like really averse to that style of communicating, I think it's something to be careful with.
It seems to me that one classic example of a confrontational approach that probably hasn't paid off would be with the anti-abortion activists who are very confrontational. I mean, to be honest with you, I haven't actually looked at the research on this, so maybe I should be careful what I say. But it seems to me, intuitively at least, like when I talk to people about this in the UK, that a lot of those confrontational abortion activists who will stand outside clinics and like shame people before they go in, that's got a very bad rep. And it seems that people focus a lot more on that than like the actual arguments for like anti-abortion. It seems that this approach has kind of hindered the movement a lot.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the movement either, but I can see that they have tactics, or they apply tactics that are generally like just very unconstructive.
So I studied psychology at undergraduate, and one of the things we learned about was persuasiveness. Mm-hmm. And we were told that essentially the more likable you are and the more relatable you are, the more likely you are to be able to persuade someone. And I suppose if we imagine people seeing angry, confrontational activists, it seems to create this divide where they're less relatable to the normal person. Of course, I suppose you're going to be less relatable just by being an activist, probably to most people. But I suppose it's like a spectrum, and you're certainly less likable if you're getting someone to feel uncomfortable and disrupting their daily lives. So I suppose that's probably an important factor, because what we're talking about is persuading people to get attitude change and possibly behavior change.
Yeah, I think anger is an interesting thing to look at, and I think that basically, I mean, if you look at myself, I'm not inclined to talk to a person for a very long time who's really angry, and I will very quickly feel that their anger is directed at me, and I feel guilty, and when I feel guilty, I'm not going to be very open. So So let's say the opposite end of the spectrum, some kind of like Buddhist-like, monk-like person, like Thich Nhat Hanh or something, who is a vegan, who does this very gently, etc., without making people feel guilty. I think in general, I mean, I have a hard time imagining that they would not be more effective in terms of their communication. And some people take this to mean that activists shouldn't be angry, even while they have so many things to be angry about. I don't want to say that people don't have a right to be angry. I think anger is a very logical emotion at all the things that we see. But we should be, I think, careful with certainly expressing this anger in a way that other people feel it's directed at them, because that's going to alienate people, I think.
Yeah, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why quite a lot of people go towards the more confrontational approach, isn't just that it gets more attention, but I don't know, I think maybe the friendly, more pragmatic approach, maybe some people feel that they're kind of betraying themselves in the sense that they're not being as assertive as they feel, they're not being as angry as they feel, and they feel like this is such an important moral issue, it's an atrocity that no one's taken seriously, that like it feels like the only appropriate action in this world is to just be incredibly angry, and maybe people feel like they're being more genuine when they're really angry and passionate and more confrontational.
Yeah, just like they might feel more genuine or less betraying of whatever when they talk about the animals all the time, you know, when they talk about going vegan, and anything less than go vegan for the animals would feel like a betrayal to their principles, to their personality, to the animals. I would say look at what is in line with results, not what is in line with your ideology or beliefs or convictions or whatever. I think that's all. It sounds very good, but it's I don't know. For me, it's not the most important thing. It's not about what is my truth. It's not about who am I? Am I true to myself? That's like stuff for adolescent literature or something. It's about like what is in line with the best results, and that's not easy to do that. I mean, you have to sometimes. Say goodbye to your default mode of being angry or being this or that, and try to do what you believe based on research, and as far as we have that, what is most effective for the animals. And that may not be the most fun thing to do, like I said, that also may be not what is most aligned with your own personality, but genuineness or speaking your truth or saying things like it is, those are not virtues in themselves, or they're not like the most important virtues, certainly, if they're not aligned with results, I would say.
Well, I have seen research suggesting that a main driver of backlash is non-vegans feeling morally judged by vegans. And I suppose just talking about this issue, you're running that risk of doing that anyway. But certainly it seems like in the current time, perhaps a more friendly, cooperative, less judgmental approach is more effective in getting people on board.
Yeah, you say in the current time, what I think is interesting is that like many people have the perception like that there's a lot that they have to be ashamed about or change or whatever, you know, like the whole woke culture, let's say, it seems to be for those people about like wanting to change other people and telling them 1,000 things that they cannot do anymore. And meat eating is one of them. So it seems that in a way we have to be extra careful today. And I think we have to also be extra careful especially with moral arguments, which touch on people's personality and which make them feel guilty, possibly a lot faster than non-moral arguments. We know from research that health vegans or health vegetarians are a lot less threatening than moral, ethical vegetarians or vegans. So people say like, oh, it's for health reasons. Oh, that's okay. I don't feel threatened. Oh, but it's for moral reasons. Oh, am I a bad person for not doing that? So that's not to say we shouldn't use moral reasons, but we should be aware, I think, of the limitations of moral arguments. Sometimes people ask me, like, what are your favorite arguments to use to convince a meat eater? And my first question would be, do we need arguments? Could we not suffice with good food? So without having a debate or something, without using all these arguments, we just give them good food. And you can imagine that once they have a good vegan taste experience, what I call it, they might be more open to hearing these arguments. So I think that's very important, because people are basically close-minded to change, close to change, because they want to keep doing what they're doing. They want to keep eating something that I really love to eat. So the thing is to show that there's no sacrifices to be made. The thing is to show, like, look, you have a perfect alternative. Start eating it to whatever degree, for whatever reason, and then we can expect people to get more open about hearing the arguments from those pesky animal rights people.
Right, yeah, interesting. I mean, I know many vegans actually who started off for health reasons. Like they went vegan because they thought it would clear up their skin or something. And then they find themselves being a lot more open to the ethical arguments and then becoming an ethical vegan later on. And we know there's psychological evidence that suggests that consuming meat or expecting to consume meat changes the way we perceive animals. So we perceive them to be less intelligent and less sentient, presumably because of the cognitive dissonance that would be caused from thinking that they're intelligent, sentient beings, but also eating them. So I was going to say that I suppose it could be the case that something like technology or environmental reasons gets people off eating animal products, and then we have this ethical revolution afterwards.
Exactly, yeah. So there could be a technological revolution before there's a moral revolution. In my book, I talk about the way that most activists go about it is we change people's attitude by giving them information. Oh, yeah, I care about animals. And then we hope that they will change their behavior. They will take the next step towards behavior change. I will stop eating animals. And sometimes it happens like that, but often there's an attitude-behavior gap. And what I say in my book is that we should also consider the opposite way. We should help people change their behavior for whatever reasons, to whatever degree. So they might be eating vegan for a while in some vegan hotel or a spa or whatever. And then it will be easier for them to change their attitudes towards animals. So we have to look at it in both ways, not just attitude towards behavior, but also behavior change and then attitude change.
You mentioned woke culture earlier, and this brings me to another question I was interested in asking you. Because it seems that veganism is associated with the political left. And I know that some people feel like that makes sense. Like, for instance, a Trump supporter can never truly be vegan, even if they were, consuming only vegan products and not buying any animal products because they're a Trump supporter. I'm wondering what you think about this, with like whether it's a good thing for veganism to be associated with any particular political parties, or whether you think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and one that is very relevant right now. I think it seems to be more logical that animal liberation, justice for animals, etc., is aligned with leftist progressive ideas, without saying, of course, that people on the right or more conservative people cannot care or should not care about animals. I don't know, strategically, I think that there is definitely a danger in it. I mean, once, and this is happening, I think people on the right, conservative people, are associating veganism with all the rest of the leftist culture and ideology, then they will have one more reason to be against. Because I think a lot of the times people are not necessarily so against a certain idea or practice, but they associate that idea or practice with a certain group of people that they're against for other reasons, So they might say, for instance, this veganism, that's the thing of the lefties who are in favor of this and this and that, and I hate this and this and that, so I'm also going to hate veganism, and because I hate the left, whatever. So I think it might be important to have organizations. I believe there's a conservative organization, anti-hunting organization or something in Britain, for instance. They're rare, but I think it would be important to have religious, conservative organizations who are pro-animals. And I think we have to allow everybody to be pro-animals, even if they are Trumpists or whatever. We cannot say like, okay, you do this and this and this wrong, so you should do this wrong as well, and you cannot do the right thing in this department. That would be strange to me. So I'm in favor of trying to reach everyone, I think it's good to be wary of the danger of polarization that exists.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that if we're going to say, in order to be vegan, you also have to agree with me with all of these other ideas, then we're just going to make our community much, much smaller and create more polarization, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. I think we should have a definition of veganism, or the vegan practice that is not too broad, not too wide, because like I say, if we include all kinds of things, it becomes just a lot more difficult. And going vegan is as difficult as we make it. If you tag on a lot of demands, it's going to get harder for so many people to join.
Mm-hmm. So another topic when it comes to strategy is this question between individual change. So trying to ask other non-vegans to become vegan or change their consumption behaviors in some way, which is the strategy that I started with. And it seems to be the strategy that is most prevalent in the grassroots movement. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's been the strategy that you've maybe focused on mostly, the kind of the Go Vegan message, and even like Peter Singer as well, I think. I think it just seems to be the main approach. And then there's this other type of activism, which is more institutional, trying to get companies to change what they're doing, or trying to get legislation change. I'm wondering like what your thoughts are on this, and if your opinions have shifted at all.
Yeah, it's not that I'm mostly into individual change, but I try to, like, the people who are into individual change, the individual activists and the grassroots people, I try to share with them what I think I've learned about that kind of change. But again, I think here the distinction is between individuals and more institutionalized activism within an organization. I think if you're an individual, if you don't have access to other people, to institutions, etc., the obvious thing that you're going to do is to talk to individuals, to talk to people in the streets, and we have to face the fact that most people don't have access to politicians and to CEOs, etc., and you get easier access within the context of an organization. But if you're run-of-the-mill individual activist, you don't have that chance, and so if you want to be useful, you're going to mostly talk to individual other people, I think. And that's certainly not bad. And I think the more people you talk to, maybe through a podcast or a video or blog, the better. I think that's definitely still useful, but I am more of a believer in institutional change because I think that as we can increase the options for people, increase the alternatives for people, and we do that through institutions, then it will become easier for people to shift more and more towards the end of the vegan spectrum. But what is important is that we still need to increase demand from the consumer side. It's possible that in terms of the vegan scene or in terms of the plant-based companies, there's some sort of bubble going on where the companies creating these alternatives are, they're creating too much options and offers for the consumer demand that is at this moment there or available. We have to make sure that this consumer demand keeps increasing, and that can be an important task for all these people who talk to other people, trying to encourage them to consume vegan products, etc.
I think we can have individual activists talking to other individuals in the street and whatnot, and still have that institutional message. So I suppose rather than saying you should go vegan because of this animal suffering, you could say things like you should donate to effective charities, you should get involved in institutional campaigns with an organization like the Humane League, or you should just get involved and join a community. So at the moment, it seems that the ask is to go vegan. I suppose we could still outreach individuals, but shift the focus to the call to action could be, we need to end animal farming collectively, rather than you need to go vegan individually.
So you're talking about still talking to individual vegans, but changing the ask. Individual meat eaters, but changing the ask. Yeah, that's definitely a good thing, I think, and definitely something that people can try. And I think that too many vegans are too focused on vegan behavior, and they lose sight of other things that they could do. And sometimes I have the impression that for a vegan, that the vegan can do nothing wrong and a non-vegan can do nothing right, but a non-vegan can donate, a non-vegan can have a big reach. Ricky Gervais is a non-vegan, but he talks about animals on his Twitter and on his Facebook, etc. And he has, when was the last time you had the reach of a couple of million people? So doing a great job even without being a vegan. We can look at other asks to people than just the ask of go vegan.
Right. So Ricky Gervais has actually recently gone vegan.
He did?
Yeah. So he's no longer a scumbag. Now he's doing everything right.
Right, yeah.
Within the effective animal activism space, a lot of researchers seem to be calling for this shift in focus towards institutional change messaging. But they're very clear, that's not to say there isn't a place for Go Vegan messaging. That isn't to say there isn't a place for like trying to get individuals to change their behavior. And there are like lots of benefits. There are probably many social benefits and psychological benefits. We mentioned the research that suggested that people view animals differently when they consume meat. So you imagine it when we stop eating the animals, that's going to have benefits to us in terms of like viewing animals as the sentient beings they are. So I talk about this study quite a lot. I probably sound like a broken record, but there's this poll by Sentience Institute that suggested that 50%, around or just under 50% of US adults supported a ban on factory farming and slaughterhouses. And in the same poll, I think it was something like 97%. Maybe that's a bit much, but like a high percentage, the vast majority believed or agreed with the statement, eating meat is a personal choice and nobody should tell me to stop. So there seems to be this huge difference in how people feel when a question is framed institutionally. I agree, as a society, we should abolish factory farming, we should abolish slaughterhouses. And when we put the focus on the individual, what should you do? They see it more as this like personal choice and how nobody has the right to tell them what to do. So it seems, or that evidence seems to suggest that we might be more effective if we put the focus on what we do as a society collectively. We'd have a lot more public support compared to like, you should go vegan, which seems to create this backlash effect and seems to make people feel very defensive.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of what's in play here is the fact that like if people would know that the whole of society would all of a sudden stop doing something that's damaging, they might be much quicker to be on board with this than when they are the only one or one of the few ones who are going to make a sacrifice, do something that they don't want to do. Like suppose that we talk about taxes. Would you like to pay more taxes to support this or that cause? I think people like us, we would say yes, but we still might say like, yeah, but I still don't want to be the only one, or I want it to be fair for everybody. I want all of us to do that. Not just that it's a drop in the ocean, which is true, but it's also like why should I be the one who makes the sacrifice? Some of us, the more enlightened ones, might still agree with that, but many people will say like, I want to do it if everyone does it, and I'm not going to be the one who the sucker who pays more taxes than everybody else. But if there's a rule that says that the whole of society has to do this, I will vote for it. I will go along with it. And I feel about that in terms of certain topics. I will not right now, for instance, adapt certain behaviors. I will not voluntarily stop doing something that I like here and there. That's possible. But if the government tomorrow says, okay, from now on this practice is banned, I will say, I accept it. I'll go along with it. So yeah, we might be in favor of this kind of institutional change, this kind of like regulations, if they apply to the whole of the public, rather than that we individually have to make a voluntary sacrifice without everybody else doing it.
Do you think the focus on trying to get individuals to go vegan, it kind of creates this this sense of it's about like what I'm causing? It's about my almost purity, I guess. I don't want to have anything come to me. I want to wash my hands clean of the issue. Whereas perhaps having an institutional focus, maybe the framing can help us think about how do we most effectively help animals. It doesn't necessarily need to be from not consuming the products. There could be more effective ways. Like Ricky Gervais making those tweets or whatever he did is probably going to be more effective than him choosing not to buy the milk on one occasion. So I think that maybe there is this feeling of like, my hands are clean, and that probably feeds into the whole non-vegans feeling judged. Whereas if we think about this collectively, probably I don't know. I'm thinking that maybe it'd be more effective in that sense.
Yeah, I think through the years in our movement, that this focus on our own personal behavior has become very big, and we want somehow in the first place, it's logical, it's understandable. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We don't want to be complicit in that horror that is happening. So we change our own behavior without pondering whether that's the most effective thing to do. I heard that there was this similar movement within the abolitionist movement. There were abolitionists who were avoiding all kinds of slavery products. But apparently after a while they gave up on that because they saw that was not something you could convince everybody of. And I think now we're even more dependent on animal products than we were ever dependent on the products of slavery. So it's a difficult ask to people to give up all these problems, or all these products. It's why we're still only a couple of percentages. But it's so tempting to focus on that and make some kind of fetish of that, just because, like you say, I think we want to wash our hands, we want to be clean, we don't want to be complicit, which I understand is very logical, and I want to be like that, but we shouldn't stop there. We should, in addition, be advocates, we should be activists. So one way I say this in my talks is what goes into your mouth is less important than what comes out of it. That's a quote from the Bible, which is coincidentally true in this case. So the words you speak, the advocacy you do, the communication you do is more important and potentially more effective and impactful than your own personal consumption. I mean, it's very logical. If I have a reach of 1,000 people or something, I can potentially create more change among all these people than I can with my own personal behavior.
Mm. There's no reason to think that it's necessarily the case that what I consume is the most important thing in terms of affecting the outcomes for the animals. And for me, like, I had this supreme focus on getting individuals to go vegan. What I felt was the answer. We just increase the population and keep going. And I don't think I really reflected on it that much. I think I did try and defend it when someone first came to me with the idea of institutional change. And I think it's partly just because one of the things you say in one of your talks, I think, is most people eat meat because most people eat meat. You know, we're very social animals. And I think most people in the grassroots movement focus on individual behavior change because most people focus on individual behavior change. So I was inspired by the likes of Leenaert and other activists on YouTube. And the answer was framed. This is the story we're telling ourselves. It's animal suffering is the problem, or animal exploitation is the problem, depending on your normative ethics. And the go vegan message is the answer. And I think I just started doing that simply because that's what everyone was doing. And so it's really important to take a moment to reflect and think about effectiveness, which is why it's really great to have these open conversations.
It's definitely part of the answer, but it's not the only answer.
And not necessarily the most effective thing.
What I see sometimes, I think this is also a reflection of it. People who approach me and they tell me something like, I have this or this friend or family member, and they're almost there, like they're 95% vegan, and they're just using still this or that. And then they ask me, like, how can I convince them to go the rest of the way and to become actual vegans? And then by myself, I say, like, I mean, is this where you have to put most of your energy in that last 5% of them, or can you just let it go and focus on something else or somebody else? Because that 5 last percentages are not going to be what makes the most difference. But these people have this idea of like, the veganism is like this moral baseline, or this point, this really, this cutoff point between what's wrong and what's right, and that's where we have to get everyone, ourselves, but also the other people, and it's maybe to some extent arbitrary. It's very nice to do, and I will keep doing it for the rest of my life. But we have to consider that other things are probably more important.
Yeah, or perhaps humans are prone to this black and white thinking, where we're seeing someone who's 95% there as morally equivalent to someone who's 0% there. When for the animals there's a huge difference there. And like you say, we'll probably be a lot more effective if we focus on the people who are 0% of the way there compared to spending a lot of time on that last 5%. The other points I wanted to raise when it comes to this kind of idea of us like washing our hands of it rather than what's the most effective thing to the animals is that if we just take a step back for a minute. And by the way, I think that like being the evolved apes that we are, I think it makes sense that we have this focus on our own individual purity, because I guess a lot of what we're doing with our behaviors, we're signaling to other humans what kind of person we are. So I guess it kind of makes sense that we kind of want to signal to people that we are ethical. But if you take a step back and think about what really matters here, what matters is the animals and how effective we are in helping animals. And I think when you take that perspective, you realize that, whether I am the personal cause of any particular being suffering isn't actually what's important. What's important is the being suffering themselves. If I can press a button and I am no longer impacting animals in terms of being the cause of their suffering, but someone else is. Well, it doesn't make a difference to the animal. The suffering feels the same whether I cause it or I don't. So I really think the focus needs to be on how can we most effectively help animals, not on how can I most effectively reduce my harm footprint in the world.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between virtue ethics and consequentialism is the focus on what are we doing right or wrong versus what are the impacts for other beings. So that's an important distinction that we can make within our philosophy and ethics and activism.
And you mentioned the free produce movement now, which was the movement to abstain from slave-made goods. And we did say earlier that, of course, looking back at social movements, other social movements has its flaws because there's many differences between them. But nonetheless, it does seem that there are lessons to be learned, and it can provide some like weak evidence. And I think that is like an interesting thing to think about, how the intense focus on personal consumption changes in a movement is unprecedented. There are no other successful social movements that has had this focus. And like you said, when we look back at other movements, the free produce movement, who did have this temporary focus on abstaining from slave-made goods, they changed tactics because they felt like it wasn't working, and they went to the institutional focus and were a lot more effective. So I do think there are lessons to be learned there.
Yeah, so on my blog a long time ago, I wrote this thought experiment asking people, would you eat meat for a lot of money? Knowing that, like, would you eat one steak for 10,000 euros or 100,000 euros? Knowing that you could give that money, if somebody was crazy enough to give it to you, to an animal rights organization so that they could help a lot more animals with that. I would do it in a heartbeat. I mean, it's a thought experiment. It's probably never going to happen, but you never know. And so this clearly shows the difference between, or this can show you what is most important to you. Is it your own purity in terms of your consumption, or is it actual impact? Of course, you might be disgusted from eating a steak and you might not be able to physically do it, but that's another matter. If I would be able to physically do it and I would get the money and be able to save animals with that, I would definitely do it. So it shows the focus on results versus the focus on our own actual behavior.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought experiment. I actually had one of those YouTube kind of back and forth with another vegan, and one of the things he asked me was, on reflection, maybe it was me who put this thought experiment out there. But if you were to eat an animal product, but it led to less animals being harmed and killed, should you eat it? And the answer for me is simple. Like, yes, I should eat it. But I was kind of called out for, not being vegan then. I'm not actually vegan because I'm eating the meat. But I think it really does pull apart that difference between, what we really care about here. Like, do we care about our own personal purity, or do we care about helping animals? And for me, it's clear that, if it was the case, hypothetically, that consuming animal products reduced suffering in the world and reduced animal suffering, then I guess I should be eating them. Because that's what matters. That's why I'm vegan in the first place. That's why I'm here having this conversation with you.
Yeah, and maybe a more realistic. It's not a thought experiment. It's just realistic. Some people are dumpster divers, or they live off meat or food products that have been thrown away. I don't see much damage or problems in somebody who eats meat that's being thrown away. It's not gonna change anything. It's not gonna have an impact on demand or whatever. So if that's the way if that's a way for them to live cheaply or whatever, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I guess there are some like nuanced arguments. Like, for instance, if other people see you doing it, it might make it more normalized to eat animals. So maybe you have to like hide it. There's also like that psychological evidence we mentioned that eating animals could actually change the way you perceive them. But nonetheless, like the supply and demand argument seems to go away. And like, I'm not going to spend any of my time protesting the dumpster divers and shaming them. Okay, so we were talking about confrontational activism, and we were thinking mostly about the effect this has in terms of getting people on board. But the other thing we haven't talked about is perhaps the effect it can have on us. Because one thought that comes to mind is how perhaps being more confrontational and more angry might increase the chances of burnout or something like that. Could you talk a little bit about burnout and like why it's an important thing to think about, or if you have any personal experience with it yourself?
So in terms of burnout, I had my own experience. I was never burned out from the cause itself, from the animal issue, but I burned out of leading an organization and leading people. I think I was not cut out for that, to be a manager or whatever. And so I struggled with burnout and some depression for half a year. After I left my organization at the time, this is 7 years ago now. Apart from that, I think I cope pretty well with the existence around me of animal suffering and the fact that it's there. I talk to people regularly who really have a hard time living in this world. And the advice that I give them would be to one of the things is, first of all, look at the wonderful things that people do. Don't become a people hater, because there is so many good stuff that we do. And one way you could see it is that, in a way, we are the first species to question our own diet. There's never been lines, as far as we know, saying oh, is it a good idea to eat gazelles? But we are doing that. So that's a beautiful point in terms of our evolution to have arrived at. Also, I think it's good to see people as victims as well. People who are victims of their own education, of their genetics, of whatever, of their situation, and they do what they do because something led them on that path. And something I like to say, and you can make abstraction of the religious framing, but there's this saying, there, but for the grace of God go I. So it could as well have been me who was doing that. If I had been raised in different circumstances, if I had had different genetics or different parents or whatever, I might have done that horrible thing. You never know. So to be compassionate towards the perpetrators, I think is something that is not only helpful and effective, but it's also good for you, because it will make you last longer. It will make it more sustainable for you. We have to remember that this is a marathon and not a sprint. We need patience. Animal abuse is going to be around for quite some time, and it is important that we can, as activists, can keep doing the work that we're doing for as long as possible. So focus on the good things, focus on so many people doing wonderful things for other people, for other animals. Focus on the fact that maybe it's not because a person is non-vegan that they're not doing amazing stuff for refugees and for the environment that maybe we are not doing. I think there's the focus on looking at the positive aspects is very important. Also, not confronting yourself too much with horrible suffering. If you know that you're going to feel bad for a week after seeing something, and sometimes it happens by coincidence or whatever, or inadvertently, but you have to try to avoid seeing those images of the things that are happening. I think I've seen things that I can never forget anymore, and it's hard. For some people, this might be motivating, but if you know that that's not you, then just avoid watching those things.
Yeah, I think a lot of activists probably struggle with this sense of urgency, that something so terrible is happening that it requires so much urgency, combined with a sense of helplessness, really, because change takes a lot of time. I think that can be a really difficult thing to struggle with, and I think the tips you gave there are good ones. But when we think not just on the individual level, but more broadly our community, I'm wondering how you think we can ensure that as a community and in the way in which we interact with each other, we can be a sustainable movement. Because like you said, animal cruelty isn't going away anytime soon. And most of the animals who are going to be harmed by humans aren't born yet. They're going to exist in the future. That's where most sentient beings are. So how can we really create a community that is conducive to continuing into the long term?
Yeah, I think research has shown that one factor that helps people to be vegan and to be activists longer is that they know other people to join. So having a community, I think, is one important aspect. You have to have like-minded people around you, if not live physically, then at least online. And I think that community has to be supportive. And there is, of course, the issue that people within this movement are oppositional towards each other, confrontational sometimes, saying you're not doing it right, or you're not a good vegan, or this is a wrong way. So I think I'm very much in favor of being tolerant towards, first of all, other approaches in terms of strategy. Like one person may be an abolitionist, the other may be advertising or campaigning for meat reduction or something. Let's not call each other traitors or whatever, but just let's accept this diversity in terms of strategies. We all have the same aim. We just have to accept that we have different ideas of getting there the fastest. And secondly, also...
Just to touch on that, sorry, before you go on, it's kind of interesting that we can kind of fight the kind of abolitionists and the welfareists can be fighting each other, because I'm pretty sure there's research of the foot in the door technique, where like a smaller ask, like for instance, asking for a welfare reform, can be a foot in the door to getting to like more radical asks. And there's also the foot in the face effect, or door in the face effect, right? Where people having the more radical ask then makes the less radical ask, or like the more like welfare-y ask, or like reducitarian ask, a lot more palatable for the person listening to it. So it actually seems that these two different strategies actually help each other. They do well working together. So it's kind of ironic, I think, that the activists in these communities can sometimes turn on each other in kind of an aggressive way, especially online.
Yeah, I guess a big part of let's say infighting is ironic and hard to understand. Part of it is also understandable. Like, for instance, I can understand the idea that some people think that if welfare of animals increases, other people will have less arguments for abolition, because people think like, okay, these animals are treated well enough, I don't need to stop eating meat. I can understand that argument. So there's definitely things that are understandable. Yeah, and then another point is that in terms of who is vegan and who is not, there as well, we should accept a variety of practicing veganism. And if one person says or calls themselves vegan, even though they eat on occasion some kind of cookie with their grandmother, or eat her pie twice a year that has some eggs in it, and she calls herself vegan, I mean, what is the use of telling that person that she's not a vegan? So there should be, I think we would be good in having a little bit more of a fuzzy definition of veganism, that it's not like a cut-off, like an all or nothing thing, like there can be 99% veganism or something. It's all fine. That's not worth fighting over. So we have to have a community where people support each other, and where you are considered to be part of the team, even if you're not the perfect vegan.
And to be clear, it's not that you're saying that it's okay to harm an animal or abuse an animal once in a while. It's more that you're saying, when we consider effectiveness, you're of the opinion that we would be more effective in terms of preventing more animals from suffering these things if we have that fuzzy definition.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, I think that it's a matter of effectiveness. We need a vegan world, not a vegan club. So we need to be welcoming to other people. And if we're going to stand there and say that, this or this person is not part of the group because their practice is not perfect, then we just make the group smaller, and then it looks as if we're just some people who want the most exclusive club in the world. That's not what we want. We want everybody to join, and we should not get hung up on our rules and our orthodoxy, etc. I think too much.
Okay, so the other topic I'm very keen to talk to you about is wild animal suffering, which is something I'm kind of keen to talk to about every vegan activist that I get onto my podcast. I'm wondering how much thought you've given to wild animal suffering, whether this was how long you've kind of been aware of it, if you are very aware of it, and whether it kind of changed your perspective at all.
Yeah, it's very much on my thoughts. I think that, while veganism is something philosophically pretty simple, wild animal welfare is a more challenging issue, and therefore intellectually more interesting. I like to think about things. I think it's a huge issue. I think that potentially there is an incredible amount of suffering in the wild. And I do believe, as more of a consequentialist than anything else, I do believe that suffering is suffering no matter what it is caused by. So if you are a rabbit that is caught in a human-set trap, or snare, or if you are a rabbit who is dying from a natural disease, suffering is suffering. And the fact that in the second case we weren't responsible for the suffering is irrelevant to the rabbit. So we have to be willing and we have to want to reduce that suffering, whatever the suffering was caused by. That I'm really strongly opinionated about, I think. As to what can we do about it, of course, that is less clear, and that is the only reason for hesitation. I think it's not a matter of like, should we or not, but it's more of a matter of like, how can we?
Right. Well, something that comes up quite a lot when people first hear about this, I think, is that they kind of say, well, there's nothing we can do. I certainly hear that a reasonable amount in my comment section. Like, it's impossible to do anything to help wild animals. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's definitely not impossible. I mean, we are in the process of, for instance, inventing or developing sterilization techniques and making sure that certain animals are not being born when their population is too high. That could be, for instance, in a confined area like a national park. I mean, making sure some elephants are not being born is, I think, better than culling elephants when there's too many of them. So that is a technique that's already being developed. There's more advanced techniques like gene drives, CRISPR, things like that, that we have to take seriously and look into, even while being very, very careful. There are, I mean, for instance, there's also not just the wild animals, but what we call the liminal animals, the animals that live on the threshold between humans and the wild. So there would be pigeons and rats. There's often an overpopulation of them. What are we going to do with that? We have in our own garden a certain population of rats that might be damaging. I mean, 2 rats can breed up to 15,000 rats in a year in optimal circumstances. That can be a problem. So what are you going to do about it? And you can do something about it with the ideal tools, cruelty-free tools to prevent them from breeding so hard. There is something that you can do about that. So definitely we should not give up. I always also think that you cannot imagine what we will be able to do in 100 years technologically, and hopefully we are more emotionally and morally and spiritually mature by then. But if we mature that way and also technologically, there might be a lot that we can do with certain confidence.
I agree. You mentioned pigeons there. I think that there is an issue in a lot of cities with the overpopulation of pigeons, and the answer has seemed to be to trap them or poison them. And we're inflicting quite a lot of suffering to them. And I think that Wild Animal Initiative actually did a little bit of work in terms of looking at like contraceptives that could be used for pigeons. So for instance, like one kind of thing that we could imagine happening would be to, rather than like trapping and poisoning these pigeons, we give them a feed that makes them infertile temporarily to reduce the population that way. So that's kind of a way in which we're already causing harm to wild animals, and we could just change our interventions to actually account for the fact that these are feeling sentient beings.
Yeah.
And perhaps that these kind of the ways in which we're already causing suffering to wild animals are going to be easier to maybe deal with and easier for the people to get on board with, maybe especially people who seem to care more about suffering that's human caused as opposed to not. I agree with you. I don't think it matters really whether, I don't think it matters intrinsically whether the suffering is caused by humans or caused by some natural disaster. But perhaps the forms of suffering that we cause as a general rule of thumb are going to be easier to solve because we can just stop or change what we're doing.
Sure, yeah, exactly. And one argument that you always also come across as soon as you raise the topic of intervening in nature is the topic of hubris, of like playing God. And I think first of all, I mean, yes, we should be careful. At every point, we should be very considerate of what is going to happen. But one thing to consider is that, I mean, people will often say like, oh yeah, whenever we did this, it went badly. But usually when we did something, it was, first of all, with bad intentions. Now it would be intervening with good intentions, not for ourselves, but for the benefit of these animals. Now, good intentions aren't everything, but certainly they will help. So that is one thing to consider. And secondly, in terms of hubris, I mean, if I want to help, if I want to prevent the suffering of wild animals, the terrible, terrible suffering, I mean, I'm always inclined to give the critics, to show them a video of animals being eaten alive and screaming while they're being eaten alive and asking them, like, is this something that you want in this world? You know, I don't want it in this world. And if you if you hear from me that I would like to ideally prevent that, ideally make sure that it doesn't exist, that no being has to suffer like that, why would you call it hubris? Why would you call it like wanting to play God? Can't you see it as just another form as compassion? The same compassion that we bring up, that we muster for farmed animals, we bring up for wild animals. That's all it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to talk about here, but this idea of playing God, nobody seems to make this argument when it comes to helping humans out of their natural suffering. Nobody complains that we're playing God when we try to prevent malaria in the third world, which is a natural disease. So it actually seems speciesist to then, when it comes to helping non-human animals who are also suffering with a natural disease, to say, no, that would be playing God. I mean, I don't think you can have it both ways. This seems very convenient that it's playing God when we're not the victims, but if we are the victims, then we want others to help us. So I really don't think that holds up, and I guess it shows the kind of scope and power of speciesism, that even people who are completely abstaining from animal products like us and other vegans, we can still have kind of very clearly like speciesist views, especially when we start considering wild animals.
Yeah.
A point you made earlier that I think is very important to emphasize is this idea that we don't know what's going to be possible in the future. So it seems very strange to conclude with certainty, as some people do, that like there's no way we'll ever be able to make any difference to help wild animals. It's like, how can we possibly know? Especially considering we haven't really researched the lives of wild animals and the ways in which we might be able to help them. It would be like concluding that, before the advent of modern medicine, concluding that there's nothing we can do to improve human health because it's so complex. It's like, well, maybe we should like look into it first before we have this conclusion.
Yeah, we shouldn't give up beforehand, obviously. And also, I'd like to think that, I mean, if we won't destroy ourselves in some war or nuclear or whatever, then we might be here in the year 5,000 or 10,000 or 100,000, and God knows what we will be able to do by then, and how great beings we might be. And if you think that hubris and arrogance, etc., then I would say, like, yeah, maybe it's what you are, is just pessimist. Like okay, we should be careful not to like get carried away and get too abstract and theoretical and thinking too far in the future, maybe. But still, I think that we should always keep dreaming of a society, of a world, of a universe that is good for everybody. And if you look at us people, what we have been trying to do as the project of our civilization is to avoid the damaging effects of our environment. We try to avoid hunger and thirst and cold and drought and whatever. Why should these other animals not have the right to avoid those things? Why should they not have the comfort that we are creating for ourselves? And if they can't create it for themselves, let us help create it. And I think that ideally, the best situation for animals is some sort of symbiotic relationship with humans. I think that in our best shape, in our best form, we can be angels. Sort of for non-human animals. Right now we're mostly devils, but we could be angels. We could help make the world a much better place for them. And I think that is down the road, that might be part of our mission.
Yeah, I agree. And like you were saying, about how we don't know what will and will not be possible, but a few hundred years ago, if you took someone from a few hundred years ago and showed them the way we live, showed them an automatic door, and they would think they were witnessing magic. So sometimes I think people feel like it's humble to say there's nothing we'll ever be able to do, and it's arrogant to suggest otherwise. But I think if we were truly humble, we'd say we don't know what will or will not be possible in the future. So we shouldn't conclude that there's no way we'll be able to help them.
I lived in a time when you literally couldn't have imagined the internet. I mean, except if you were a total visionary. But I lived in a time when the internet was something that was not conceivable. I mean, you are younger, you're, I guess, a digital native. But if you go back far enough, you had no idea of the things that are possible today, even within one lifetime.
On the question of predation that you raised earlier, I know something we were talking about last night was this idea of a status quo bias. So I've talked a lot about the nature bias that we have which is very clear. As we also have this status quo bias. And one interesting thought experiment is to imagine that predation didn't exist. So animals didn't eat each other alive. There was only herbivores, and they didn't have to experience the fear or the pain of being eaten. Would we intervene to make predation a thing? You'd have to be you'd sound completely psychopathic to think that was a desirable outcome.
Yeah. And people might say like this is a completely unrealistic thought experiment because we're not in that situation. But if you look at situations where we are reintroducing predators, it becomes quite similar to that thought experiment. And many people will be in favor of reintroducing wolves and whatever, and they might have an ecological function and etc. But on the whole, I would not be in favor of introducing a predator where there was none and where there was an okay situation without the predator.
Yeah, of course, there could also be other alternatives to controlling population sizes other than introducing an animal to eat them alive.
Yeah, exactly. But also you have to take into account, and I don't want to be pro-hunting or something, but this is again the idea of washing our hands in innocence. If we don't have to cull a population because there's an overpopulation, we let the wolf do it and then it's fine. Yeah. The wolf did it, right? But if you look at the situation for the animals in question, certainly if you would compare the process of the wolf killing the animal to the ideal, very compassionate way of euthanizing an animal, probably the latter way, by a human, probably the latter way is better for that animal. It's better than to live in fear and to be killed in fear and in anxiety and etc. So it's not because we leave something to nature that it's going to be any better for these animals in question. It might be better for our conscience or something. It might feel better, but it's not better for the animals in question. If you were that rabbit, you probably would say, like, please give me some kind of like injection rather than let me be devoured by a wolf.
Yeah, it does seem ironic, I guess, that like many animal activists will be very much against hunting, which I think is the right thing to be against, but then also be in favor of introducing wolves to kill the animals that the hunters would kill. Because when you take the perspective of the victim, it seems that being eaten alive is probably far worse. So I do feel like we need to keep in mind the perspective of the animal rather than thinking about whether our hands are clean of it. And in the case of rewilding, our hands aren't clean of it because we are literally introducing the wolves, It's not truly natural, which is another point. I mean, this idea of what's natural and what isn't is very blurry and seems arbitrary at times.
Yeah. I think reintroducing the wolf, or a lot of our fascination with megafauna, etc., is really quite anthropocentric. It's about what we like to see in nature and what our conception of nature is. And I think we are often projecting our idea of what nature should be on the natural world, even as other people might accuse the people who want to intervene in nature, like you and me are, they might accuse us of projecting our values. But I think that if you assume that an animal in nature doesn't want to suffer, and wants to avoid horrible suffering, there's not that much chance of us projecting our values on them. I think that's just reality. I think that's just what every being wants to do is avoid terrible suffering.
So I'm of the opinion that I am, I guess, forcing my values onto nature. But I think that there aren't any values that just happen to exist because of natural selection. I don't think that Mother Nature is a sentient being who has like certain values and that it ought to be a certain way. I think that we are the ones who value suffering, and of course the animals are out there in the wild, and therefore it makes perfect sense for us to actually change things in the world to make this place a better place to live. I don't think there's anything wrong with us kind of like spreading our values and changing nature to fit our values.
Although there might be conflicts in preferences, like you could try to assess the difference in preferences between, on the one hand, autonomy and freedom for animals, and on the other hand, avoiding harm. And then some people could say, like, oh no, the best for the animal is very clearly to be autonomous and to go wherever they want with the risk of certain dangers and starvation, etc. Or you might say, like, probably the animal is better off if it has a bit less autonomy, but if it at the same time it is protected from predators and has medical care, etc. So the chickens in our garden, they have a very big area. I think they feel pretty autonomous, but they could be more autonomous if they could roam everywhere. But then they wouldn't have protection from predators, protection from diseases. They wouldn't get feed from us, etc., etc. I mean, making abstraction of the natural ways in which we got to the chicken. But in general, I mean, there might be differences in those preferences, and we could be projecting our preference for autonomy or for the absence of suffering or the natural world. I think that's possible. But my idea is that, like, if we think that what animals love most of all is to avoid suffering, I don't think there's much chance that we are off.
So for those people watching and listening on YouTube, apologies for the technical difficulties. We've now changed camera angle because one of my cameras have run out of batteries. Anyway, moving on. This idea of autonomy of wild animals I find kind of interesting because if we're not just focused on the harms and exploitations caused by humans, then you can certainly argue that one animal is losing their autonomy when they're being ripped apart by another animal, or one animal is losing their autonomy when there isn't enough resources to go around, or when a parasite is slowly eating them alive and they don't want that. There are many ways in which animals lose their autonomy that aren't human caused. So I don't really feel like that argument for autonomy really holds up, though it is quite common. The other point I wanted to quickly make was that we've talked a bit about predation, and I'm always kind of wary when I do that because, well, firstly, it's more complicated than other causes of suffering in nature because you've got this conflict of interests between two other animals, and also because it's kind of the poster child of wild animal suffering, where people think, well, how can you do anything about predation? That's ridiculous. And then they don't think about any other forms of suffering in nature. But actually, there's lots and lots of different forms of suffering in nature, ones that are probably going to be easier to solve than predation. So even if it were the case that there's nothing we can do about predation, which I don't think is true, but even if that were the case, that wouldn't mean that we can't help wild animals suffer less. So there are a few points I wanted to make there. The other thing I wanted to quickly cover is I'm thinking that maybe there's something interesting psychologically going on when people instantly go to, there's absolutely nothing we'll ever be able to do about this. It's impossible to help. This is a waste of time. And part of my thinking is that we kind of, as humans, we want to have a positive outlook on the world. If it is the case that wild animals are suffering terribly, it's kind of psychologically difficult to deal with, perhaps. Maybe acknowledging that this is something that we can do something about and that we ought to do something about means you have to really acknowledge it is a problem, and therefore you've kind of got to deal with maybe some difficult emotions that, like, the world is actually like this.
Yeah, it's quite possible that people don't want to see that nature is red in tooth and claw, and that we want to live in ignorance. I mean, first of all, we still are researching to what extent there is suffering in nature. I mean, there definitely is suffering, but for how many beings it is a lot of suffering, or long-term prolonged suffering, or whatever. It's hard to say. Differs from species to species, etc. On the other hand, there is this interesting observation that while if you want to help farmed animals, you have to give something up. You know, you have to give up eating meat, and that's what makes it harder to care about farmed animals. In terms of wild animals, you don't have to give anything up to help them. So I've heard Oscar Horta, who researched this, say that people are often less resistant to the idea of helping wild animals than to helping farmed animals, just exactly because there's nothing to give up there. There's no sacrifice to be made. So I think it goes a bit both ways. There's factors that are pointing in either direction.
Mm-hmm. I suppose, interestingly, it's kind of this idea of not wanting to see the suffering in nature is kind of analogous to how a lot of people feel when it comes to farmed animals. They will kind of like turn a blind eye. We don't want to actually be confronted with it because it's unpleasant to think about. And I guess that's kind of analogous in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. With the difference that in the case of farmed animals, there's also the additional complexity of the consequences for ourselves if we look. It's like people saying, I don't want to watch Earthlings because then I'll have to become a vegetarian or a vegan. That's not the same with watching a nature documentary. That's just, it's only, I don't want to watch it because it's cruel.
Yeah, although of course nature documentaries are often presented in a way that I think kind of romanticizes nature and gives us unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, yeah, and when they show these hunting scenes, etc., they are presented as something magnificent, and they show the skills of the hunter and things like that, and so it is something that's meant to be awe-inspiring rather than that it is something cruel, which it is.
So I think we've been talking for around an hour and a half now, and we've covered all the main topics I wanted to. I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. I suppose I should end by emphasizing again that, we are aware that we are very flawed apes who are prone to mistakes and cognitive biases. And of course, I do think we've talked about such a range of topics that there's probably going to be people who disagree with us, and that's okay. I think what's really important is that we encourage people in the community to have these conversations about effectiveness. I think that can only create good things.
Yeah, one of the things I'm enthusiastic about is the idea of what I call slow opinion, that people take some time to form an opinion and not jump to conclusions about anything. And that will make us more tolerant and also more effective, and also it's better for ourselves because we get less worked up when we don't get irritated so fast about somebody else's opinion, which we think is wrong, but which we haven't necessarily given enough consideration.
And other than buying your book, How to Create a Vegan World, how can people learn about your ideas and your conversations around strategy?
Yeah, I'm quite active on Facebook, sometimes with certain controversial ideas. Normally, I also write on my blog, veganstrategist.org. You can find a lot of information and thought experiments there. But at this moment, it's a bit. It's been quite some time since I last wrote there.
Great. Well, it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. So thanks so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you about these issues. And just a reminder to everybody listening, this podcast is only possible because of the support I receive on Patreon. So thanks so much to everybody who is giving support there. And please do consider doing so yourself if you find this content valuable. Another reminder is that not only is this available on YouTube, but it's also available on pretty much any podcast streaming platform you use, including Spotify. So if you're still listening, thanks for still being here. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. And thank you, Tobias, for joining me today. And I'll see you very soon with another podcast episode.